Welcome to Living Grounded, Village's weekly Q&A, where you can ask anonymous questions about God, the Bible, life with Jesus, and all things in between.
Hey there, welcome to Living Grounded. I'm sitting in for Ella again. We've got a couple questions today. One of them's a flow-on from a question that we had at Q&A on Sunday, and I'll get into that in a moment. But first, let me sort of recap what Sunday looked like. We're going through Matthew at the moment, and we're looking at the moment at Jesus' teachings on a whole bunch of big topics. The ones that we saw on Sunday were anger and lust, two massive things that we have to wrestle with. And Jesus shows, I suppose the picture is that God's people are to never be people who ask, what can I do to just do the bare minimum to be right in this situation? But rather we're people of generosity. We go over and above in our hope for righteousness.
Yeah, where our righteousness is to surpass the Pharisees.
But let's get into our questions, hey?
What's your name, by the way?
I'm Ryan.
Good. Just checking.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
In Psalm 51, you've got David says to God, you and you alone, against you and you alone have I sinned. It's in the context of him very clearly sinning against a person. And yet he says, it's against you, God, and you alone that I've sinned. Well, how do we make sense of that?
This question came up from Sunday, and thankful that it was asked, because it's been an interesting little investigation. Let me give people the context, particularly for those who may not be aware of Psalm 51 and so on. Psalm of David, and we're given the subscript to the psalm saying that it's when the prophet Nathan came to him after David had committed adultery with Bathsheba. So if you're not familiar with the story, essentially King David, already married, he witnesses from his palace a woman bathing on her rooftop. This is Bathsheba. Decides that he must have her. Unfortunately for him, she is married, but that doesn't stop David, and so he commits adultery with this woman, but goes even further than that, organizes essentially to make sure her husband is killed in war, goes to quite significant lengths to do that. So essentially, and the Bible's pretty clear on this, he murders her husband. So this is pretty dark stuff, and eventually, in kind of justice, the first child of David and Bathsheba actually will not survive, and this psalm comes at a point of David's quite low. He's been confronted by the prophet Nathan with his sins. And so you've got verse 1, have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash away all my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, my sin is always before me. Against you, you only have I sinned, and done what is evil in your sight. So you are right in your verdict, and justified when you judge. Surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me. Yet you desired faithfulness even in the womb. You taught me wisdom in that secret place. And it goes on. There's lots more there, and I encourage you to read it. Psalm 51 is very, very powerful psalm. But, to come to the question, so at first glance, David seems to be pretty thoughtless here. Sure, I think we can all get on board with, yes, you have sinned against God. But is he oblivious to his sin against Uriah? To his sin against Bathsheba? To his sin against the army who he actually abandoned in order to be with her? And to the whole people of Israel who he's king. He's supposed to be a leader amongst them, a righteous leader, and he has failed in that miserably.
It's almost like what we saw Jesus spoke against on Sunday, where he says it's so important to reconcile with the human side of sin that you ought to leave your gift at the altar and run and go.
Has he failed to do anything like that? Now, there's two possibilities here, okay? The first one is relatively simple. It could just it could be a translation thing between Hebrew and English. The word translated as you only, so only in the Hebrew, can also could mean something like above all others. So in a class of your own. So it could read in the English, against you above all others have I sinned. And I think if that was the case, then we could go, fine. Sure. That's not David going, I haven't sinned against these people or whatever. It's just acknowledging that sin at its core, its ultimate nature sin is against God first and foremost. And he's just highlighting that in his language.
Yeah, okay. So that's one option.
That's one option. And to be honest, I don't think it's the right one.
Okay.
I think the second option is probably more likely. I'll explain why. And that is that David is speaking theologically. Again, not necessarily dismissing what he's done against other humans, but honoring the true nature of sin by seeing that all sin is ultimately against God. So what makes something sin? I mean, what is a sin and what makes something a sin? Well, rather than it being a sin because I have harmed someone else, it is ultimately a sin because by nature, sin is a transgression of God's law. So, thought experiment sort of thing. Without God, like if there was existence without God, there would be no such thing as sin because there would be no holy God to sin against. Okay, you could still harm people in that thought experiment.
Sure.
You could still do evil towards people, but it wouldn't be sin.
Yeah, not categorically because it's not in comparison to God's holiness.
There is no God's holiness to sin against. There is no universal cosmic law to sin against, essentially.
Yep.
So the sense is that the only reason anything is a sin is because there is a God and he is holy, and of his holy law that governs creation, that is what we sin against. And it is really interesting, actually, as I looked into this. Nowhere in the Bible do you find anyone describing what they have done to another person, okay? Tons of places where you've got sin hurting someone else, but I couldn't find somewhere where it's described as I've sinned against you. It is always I have sinned against the Lord. The only possible exception is the prodigal son, where the prodigal son comes back and he says to the father, I've sinned against heaven and sinned against you. But what's the metaphor of the prodigal son? The father is God.
Sure.
So
yeah.
I think actually that is just more of the same. And I think this is probably what's going on in Psalm 51. To be really clear, it is not David diminishing or avoiding the harm he has done to other humans. He is speaking to God and he is recognizing a theological reality, which is that when we sin, it does affect people, it hurts people, it harms them, but ultimately the sin is against God. It's because of him and his holiness that sin is sin, and outside of him that there would be no such thing as sinning. And it's just acknowledging that reality, recognizing that.
Yeah, I wonder if there's a connection there to, this idea of God's image, and even Cain, who's the first murderer. God says, I'll put a mark on you and curse anyone or kill anyone who kills you.
Sure.
And there's a thing there of Cain is valuable because he is an extension of God as his image, and and therefore a sin against man is a sin against God, is all I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I think that is right. Except just to be real, it's never a sin against man. Is the point? It's harm done to a person. Let's just go with that language.
Yep.
But the sin is always against God.
Okay.
And if we want to take it to the ultimate space where you see it, when we stand when we die, who will we stand before? All our victims? No. We will not be judged by our victims. We will be judged by God ultimately, because that's who we've sinned against, even as other people have copped the consequences of our sins.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think it's just really important to be clear on the Bible. Psalm 51 is not diminishing or saying that there is no harm done to humans. It's just using a theological language of sin to highlight something about the nature of sin.
No, that's really clear. Thanks.
It's interesting.
Our second question is aren't we victims as well as perpetrators of the curse of sin? We didn't choose Adam as our federal head, which you might have to explain that term.
Yeah.
Or did we choose? So I suppose where are the lines there of, I didn't choose to get born into sin.
Yes.
Yes, I choose sin every day.
Is it fair to be held accountable for it?
But I'm almost destined.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think many people will resonate with the idea of this question, even as they might not have framed it this way or used this sort of language, usually in connection with the consequence of sin. Around the idea of, well, hang on, it feels unfair that hell feels unfair when we're born into sin and we didn't really have a choice of whether we would be born sinners or not.
Yeah.
The consequences of sin seem really harsh. And also, can we hold sin as being as bad as the Bible does when we're victims as well, or as perpetrators of sin? So something along those lines. I think that's important. I'll get to the federal head stuff, but I think most important is just to understand how culturally shaped some of this question often is. We live in a cultural moment that emphasizes mercy over justice. We think very much in terms of victimhood rather than what we might call perfect justice. And so I think we need to just recognize that we're coming to the Bible not necessarily with unclouded eyes.
Yeah.
But that we are culturally shaped as we engage with the scriptures, which affect how we feel about them, and how we engage with certain aspects of them.
I think we'd be shocked to know that, as our problem with God is, God, why aren't you more merciful? You seem a bit evil.
Yeah.
And a whole other portion of the world's problem with God is, God, where is your justice?
Yeah.
Things are just falling apart.
You show mercy to people where you shouldn't.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think here's what we need to say. Yes, we are a victim in some sense in the way that this question frames it. We heard it in Psalm 51. We are born into sin. That's not something we chose. It's just as a child born in the southern states of America during the American Civil War was born into the rebellion. They didn't choose to be rebels. They just were. They were born into it, and they suffered some of the consequences of that. But I don't think that thinking takes into account enough of the true nature of sin. The nature of sin, and again, that's captured in Psalm 51 that we just looked at last question, helpfully, is that, let's do another little thought experiment. Let's say that you could choose the place of your birth. Let's say you could choose whether to be born into God's kingdom as a follower of God, born that way, or born into rebellion against it. Outside of God's grace, the nature of sin is that you would always choose to be born into rebellion. Unless you were a perfect being as Jesus is, or unless you were without sin as Adam and Eve were, and even they eventually chose rebellion, you would choose rebellion because that is the nature of sin. It's an inevitability as part of who we are now, the reality we are born with. Now, yes, there is a sense in which you didn't choose that, but it's also just the reality as we experience in lots of parts of the world, right?
Yeah, but I still don't feel like I chose to be born into sin, to be a sinner in the first place.
No, and you didn't. But that is that's the reality that we find ourselves in. We don't choose whether we will be born in poverty or riches, with perfect health or genetic issues. Really, this is just like our DNA now. Sin is passed down the line. That's what the whole federal head thing is. We are born of Adam. We are of Adam. He has passed down his DNA to us to a certain extent, his spiritual DNA to us, which is sinfulness. And we need to remember that in the midst of that, in the midst of feeling victim, life itself is a gift from God. None of what we have received is entitled. We are entitled to. It is all privilege. He didn't need to give us life, and maybe the whole question around this, and this is really hard and a bit dark, but maybe part of you wonders whether it would even be better if he didn't give us life in the beginning. But I think that's to miss the mercy of God and his kindness, his kind offer to sinners, that we are not destined in the sense that every human, because of their sin, will certainly suffer the full penalties of their sin. Humans get some common grace. All humans get some common grace, get to share some joy in life, but ultimately the opportunity of God and his mercy is to say, no, there is an opportunity for eternal life. You can have full mercy in Jesus. You can enjoy not something that, again, you were never entitled to, which is paradise with God. And of course, that comes down to the wages of sin is death, and death there being a much stronger word than the way we use it. Not nothingness, not an end, but eternal torment. But God, in his mercy, has said, well, someone needs to suffer the consequences of sin, but it doesn't have to be you. I've sent my son. Jesus can pay it, or we can. And so in Jesus, we can actually have a new federal head who passes his DNA down to us, who makes us righteous and free from sin, who leads us not into sin, but who leads us into paradise if we trust him and follow him. So that is the good news in the midst of the hard news, that even though we didn't choose to be born into sin, we were.
Is the idea that we get a new federal head in Jesus. That's cool. One that leads us to life, not leads us to death.
That's the story of Romans 5.
Wonderful. Thanks for being with us. Thanks for asking those questions. What do you have coming up on Sunday? Are you preaching?
Yeah, preaching. And look, it's going to be a big one. It's always, whenever we engage with the Word of God, that has massive implications for our life. But I think this Sunday, many would agree that this will be a trickier one than usual. Jesus has got a number of other examples that he gives of of spaces where he encourages these people to think, what does it look like to live a life that surpasses the righteousness of the Pharisees? He speaks to our hearts, but one of the examples he brings up is divorce. And, that's a very tough one for us today. And so we're going to wrestle with that. We're going to think about what that means. Next, living grounded, in fact, because I won't be able to do everything I'd like to do on Sunday in regards to divorce. Next, living grounded, we will focus on divorce, maybe answer a few questions, but also kind of do a big picture of what does the Bible say about divorce, more than I can probably do on Sunday.
Yeah, well, and it's a topic that needs it, and Jesus is very clear in the two verses, well, he seems to be very clear in these just two verses on divorce, but it's a topic this big, and the rest of the Bible has this much to say about it as well.
Yeah, that's right.
Sounds great. And Pray
Yeah.
for our church.
Pray for me.
Pray for Tim.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for being with us. Nice to do this with you. Bye.
Ciao.